Hello, I'm Gary Gerolman, race director of the Glen Lake Swim. This year's event is subtitled The Glenny Zone, and we will be paying tribute to the Twilight Zone, one of the greatest television series of all times. Today, we will be having a conversation with Marc Zicree, who is a notable science fiction author, screenwriter, and Hollywood producer. He's written for all the major studios, and he's also the author of the Twilight Zone Companion, which is the definitive episode by episode guide to the original Twilight Zone series. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Marc, you wrote the first edition of the Twilight Zone Companion when you were in your 20s. How did
Yeah.
that come about?
The three shows that made me want to be a writer were the original Twilight Zone, the original Star Trek, and the original Outer Limits. And by the time I got out of college, I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer working in TV, but there were no classes in that. And so I thought, well, I'll write a book about one of the greatest shows ever made, and I'll learn by that process how to actually make great television. And also I'd met one of the writers, George Clayton Johnson, when I was a teenager, and that kind of led to that decision. Additionally, it was 2 years after Rod's death when I started working on the book, and obviously, if Rod Serling had still been alive, he would have been the one to write the book, the definitive book on the Twilight Zone. So, because Rod was gone, I thought, well, why not me? And then, so I spent 3 months interviewing people who'd worked on the show. I was around 21, 22 years old, because I'd already heard that Rod's widow had turned down major journalists who wanted to write about the Twilight Zone. And I thought if I just go to her without any prep, she'll say no, because I had sold one short story. My degree was in art. And, it would have been ridiculous. But because I'd spent 3 months researching the subject, I knew a lot about the subject. And I also, because I'd interviewed 30 people, and I felt very, very sure I could do the book. And so I went to Carol Serling's house, which is of course Rod's house, exactly as he had left it. And I made my pitch for how I wanted to do the book. And clearly she talked to some of the people I'd interviewed, and they said, well, he seems like he knows what he's doing. And then she said, yes, you've got full access to everything. And that was phenomenal, wonderful.
Yeah, the book is really amazing. I mean, the detail on every episode is phenomenal. Um,
Thanks.
Now, why don't we start by talking a little bit about Rod Serling, who, as you mentioned, passed away at a very young age, 50 years old, I believe.
Yeah.
First, Rod wasn't short for Rodney, was it?
No, it was Rodman Edward Serling,
Uh-huh.
and he was really I was an unusual name and also an unusual and unique man. He was as a child, he was just full of ideas, full of stories, very outgoing, very charming, and brilliant, and people just liked him. And you can really see when you watch a Twilight Zone episode. I mean, what you see on the screen is what you get. If you'd met Rod, he was just warm, friendly, just
Yeah.
an amazing man. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and he was a decorated World War II veteran, wasn't he?
Yes, yes. He as soon as he graduated high school, he joined the paratroopers, and he was jumping out of airplanes into jungles filled with people trying to kill him. And he was wounded severely at one point, hospitalized. And but he was as hard a fighter as any of them. And it's just an amazing man, and that really deepened him, that experience of war. He came out of that really needing catharsis, and he turned to writing for that purpose.
Yeah. And he did some amateur boxing while he was in the army, didn't he?
Golden Gloves. He won 17 out of 18 bouts, and the 18th bout they had to carry him out of the ring. So that was kind of he said, okay, enough of that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Eh,
he was only 5'4", 5'4.5".
yeah,
So
yeah.
people don't know he was really short. And but yeah, and but still he was, his spirit certainly was big.
And his blocking experience ended up being featured in some of his writing, didn't it?
Yes.
Requiem for a
Yes. Well,
Heavyweight.
he wrote Requiem for Heavyweight as a episode of Playhouse 90 on live TV. Then it was made into a movie and then later a Broadway play. And he also wrote a great Twilight Zone episode called The Big Tall Wish about a
Right.
box past his prime, a wonderful episode. Rod had great empathy for people, and
Yeah.
whether it was boxers or just people working as bank tellers or, sales girls or teachers or whatever, his he wasn't a rich guy who was a snob. He was a guy who came from the working class and really had compassion and empathy for them. And I think the great secret of why Twilight Zone works, because you can watch an episode and know what the twist ending is. You can watch it a number of times,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
still it's not your enjoyment of it is not diminished.
yeah. And speaking of Requiem for Heavyweight, oh, so well written, character development, it was
Yes.
incredible. I really loved the Anthony Quinn version, Jackie Gleason and Mickey Rooney, and
Yes, yes, yes. Amazing actors. And
yeah,
it's fun because when Rod was doing Twilight Zone, the talent pool of actors was amazing. Mickey Rooney did an episode of Twilight Zone for Rod, and Rod also wrote a Playhouse 90 called The Comedian that Mickey Rooney starred in. It won Rod one of his Emmys, and just Mickey Rooney was an amazing dramatic actor as well as being in the Andy Hardy movies and all that stuff.
yeah. No, backtracking a little bit, one of Rod's earliest jobs was at a radio station. Do you think that was like the springboard, excuse the swimming reference, to his career in script writing?
Well, I think Rod very much wanted to be in a mass medium. He wanted to reach a large audience.
Mhm.
And so, unlike some of my other friends and mentors like Ray Bradbury, who wanted a career in prose, and he wrote movies and TV shows as well, but books and short stories were his main outlet of creative expression. Rod, I think, wanted to be. He started out submitting radio scripts, and he worked in radio when he was in college, and immediately afterwards, but then television was becoming a new medium. Television kind of debuted in the late 40s. And so Rod very easily made the transition from radio drama to television drama.
Yeah. Now his first major script writing success was Patterns, wasn't it? And
Yes,
that's a fabulous movie that, I mean, still holds true today, I think,
yes, yes. Well, it's very interesting because it's about a young man on the rise and trying to decide where he draws the line in terms of moral compromise. And I think Rod was a very ambitious young man, so that character sort of a surrogate for him. And it was done as a live TV episode on Kraft Television
Yeah.
Theater, and then made into a feature. That
Right.
during those early years of live television, if a TV play kind of hit big like Marty, they would then be made into movies. And so that was true with both Requiem for Heavyweight and Patterns. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And human nature, morals, and compassion seem to be the hallmark of his writings right from the beginning. Uh,
Yes.
how were those ethical undertones of his script writing received by the studios and advertisers?
Well, they appreciated his gifts with dramatic storytelling and with character and all of that, unless he was stepping into anything they considered controversial. So if he wanted to talk about politics, if he wanted to talk about racial issues, because this is right the height of the civil rights era, the murder of Emmett Till, a young black teenager, really affected Rod deeply, and he felt very constrained by the censors in the fact that he couldn't really directly address, express his opinions about those issues. So that's what led him into Twilight Zone, because by making science fiction, he could kind of slip the meaningful point past the censors, and that worked out really well for him.
Yeah, I think that the quote I read was, I think it's Rod's quote, a Martian can say things that a Republican or a Democrat can't.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
exactly,
that's great.
exactly, exactly. But the irony, of course, is that if Rod hadn't been censored, he would have just stayed as a TV dramatist, and by now he'd probably be forgotten because the people who were writing alongside him, Patty Chayefsky, Tad Moselle, Reginald Rose, those are names that most people don't know. But of course, Rod Serling is as famous as John Wayne, or whatever. He's an icon,
Yeah,
and that was a Twilight Zone. So it was a lucky irony that censorship is what led him to creating his masterpiece.
yeah. And there were how many? 156 episodes in all in the 5 years that it was
That's
broadcast?
right. It ran for 5 seasons. The fourth season was 18-hour-long episodes, which are not as seen as often as the half hours.
Yeah,
And but it was 156 episodes, and Rod wrote 92 of them himself, which
that's
is
incredible.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah,
considering that every single episode is different characters, different settings, different. I mean, there's so much you have to establish in a fresh half-hour story. The range of it is incredible.
yeah. Now, what were some of the episodes that present a clear ethical or moral message?
I guess all of them.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
no, but I
I,
mean, you could pick a handful. For instance, Eye of the Beholder, where a woman is sitting in a hospital room with her head wrapped in bandages,
yeah,
and
that's great.
she's supposedly hideously ugly. She's waiting to see if
Yeah,
the final surgery will make her look normal, and if
yeah,
not, she's going to be segregated with the other abnormal looking people. I mean,
yeah.
this is just amazing. This is years before you had disability rights or any of that stuff,
Right,
and yet
right.
such a plea for us to have compassion for the other, compassion for
Yeah,
someone who
yeah,
is, whom we might be repulsed by. And then of course, Death's Head Revisited. It's written about a concentration camp commandant who goes back to visit the concentration camp for nostalgia after the war, and is confronted by the ghosts of the inmates he killed. I
yeah,
mean, it's a phenomenal piece of work,
yeah.
and
Night
on
of
and
the
on.
Meek, that
Yeah,
was marvelous.
Night of the
Yeah.
Meek with Mark Carney Santa. Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is probably the greatest
Oh,
piece
I love
about
that. Yeah.
mob hysteria. Yeah, and I mean, Monsters Due on Maple Street, it's timeless because the fact that it points out how people can be manipulated by fear to scapegoat each other and tear each other down. That's so incredibly perceptive. It's always current. It's always relevant.
Yeah. Now, how did it come to be that, Rod would narrate the opening and closing of each episode?
Yeah, well, that was really funny because he didn't, he had been like in drama club in high school. He was a ham, but he hadn't thought of himself as an actor since that, and or a performer. And originally they did the pilot, and I produced the Blu-ray set of Twilight Zone. You can actually see the original version of the pilot, Where Is Everybody? And it has this narrator named Westbrook von Voorhees, who was the voice of March of Time. So he has this big booming voice, and it's so wrong for Twilight Zone. And then they were thinking of hiring Orson Welles, but he was too expensive. And finally, they were sort of running out of options. And Rod said, "Well, how about me?" And they just fell out of their chairs laughing. But then they gave it a try. And he was the perfect choice. Of course, it made him a TV star.
Yeah,
And that was so. It's funny because Rod exists both as this astonishing writer producer, and also as this TV personality, iconic.
yeah,
So I recently wrote a piece for San Diego Comic-Con because this is 100. It would have been Rod's 100th birthday on Christmas, upcoming
right.
Christmas. And I mentioned that Rod is as visually iconic a character as Marilyn Monroe or Bogart or James Dean. These people who are instantly recognizable, and Rod is one of those iconic characters.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
he's
Now,
perfect.
one of the really fun things about the Twilight Zone is seeing all the now famous actors and actresses that appeared in the show very early in their careers.
Yes,
I'll be watching an episode, see a familiar face, and I'll grab your book and go, "Aha! I thought that was Robert Redford, or I thought that
yes,
was Lee Van Cleef, or was that
yes, yes.
Leonard Nimoy?"
I know.
Yeah.
It's
Um,
fun. It's really fun how they pop up.
yeah. Who are some of the notables? I mean, the
Oh
list
my God.
just goes on.
Well,
It's
well,
incredible.
well, because Twilight Zone ran from 1959 to 1964, it was the perfect period to get the up and coming actors who would become
Yeah.
movie stars in the 70s and so forth, and also the fading stars from the golden age of Hollywood. So he gets
Right.
Robert Cummings and Ida Lupino and Howard Duff and all these people from the golden age of Hollywood, and Brian Aherne, but he also gets Lee Marvin and Lee, as you said, Lee Van Cleef and Robert Duvall and Robert Redford and Elizabeth Montgomery and the list is pretty much endless. I mean, you can just keep going, and it's phenomenal. Every single week, it was phenomenal.
Yeah. Now, do you have personal favorite episodes?
My favorite probably is Walking Distance, which was Rod's
Yeah.
favorite. It's about a man who goes back in time to his hometown of his childhood and wants to kind of stake a claim. And that was deeply personal to Rod because when he was in World War II, his dad died very suddenly of a heart attack at age 52, and Rod wanted to go home for the funeral, and he wasn't allowed to.
Yeah.
And so Walking Distance is really Rod being able to go back and say his farewell to his father that he didn't get to say in real life.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful piece of work.
And the little boy is played by Ron Howard, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes,
That's
and
pretty cool.
so it's very fun, very, very fun, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's almost like Twilight Zone's almost like a Where's Waldo game where you're looking for these people.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Now,
yeah,
another child actor that was in the Twilight Zone was Billy Mooney. Is it Mooney or Mum?
yes, Mummy,
Mooney.
Mummy, yeah,
Um, and he was in It's a Good Life, and what else?
And Praise of Pip
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and the telephone one. Yeah,
But
exactly.
in the book, you tell a funny story about you were a Lost in Space fan, and
Yes.
you picked up the phone and called his house.
When I was 7, yeah, I was homesick in bed with a cold, and I got the and Lost in Space was on the network at the time, and I got the idea of pulling out the white pages, the phone directory. They used to have a phone directory where everyone's number would be in it. It was handed out, every 6 months, and so I just started calling the stars of Lost in Space, and for the most part, it was people who had the same name but weren't the same people. But there
Yeah,
was one Mooney in the phone book. It must have been his dad, because when I called, and I was in my pajamas, 7-year-old kid at home. My mom was a working mom, and his mom answered. Billy Mooney's mom answered. I said, "It's Billy there." And he came on the phone. And I was so nervous, all I could do was blurt out, "Will you be my friend?" and hang up. But then when my mom got home, I told her what I'd done, and we called back. And as soon as I was over my cold, I went to Bill's house, and we traded comic books, and we've known each other ever since I was 7. And interestingly enough, the TV series I'm writing and producing and directing now, Space Command,
mhm.
stars Bill Mooney. He's in it.
Oh,
And so it's
cool. Yeah,
really fun to be from 7 to 70, to
yeah,
be
yeah,
this
yeah.
amazingly talented guy.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Now, the Twilight Zone secret sauce was the surprise or twist ending of each episode.
yeah,
And Rod was also one of the original screenwriters of Planet of the Apes. And the
yes.
shocking ending where the Charleston Heston character, Taylor, discovers the half-buried Statue of Liberty and realizes it's on Earth the idea came from a Twilight Zone episode, didn't it?
Well,
Shot an arrow in the air.
it's sort of. I mean, it's that has a reveal of like telephone poles and people and three and some the astronauts who think that they were on an asteroid. They realize they crashed back to Earth.
Yeah,
But
right.
but the main thing was that Rod was the first screenwriter on Planet of the Apes, and he came up with the idea of the Statue of Liberty. And originally he was thinking budgetarily, and it was just going to be the arm coming up out of the sand. But then they did this astonishingly wonderful matte painting of the top half of the statue all rusted and corroded and
Yeah,
broken. And it's one of the great images
yeah,
in the history of cinema. And the only reason that another writer was brought on was simply that they originally it was going to be set in a 20th century
yeah.
kind of technology with the apes. And the studio just said it was too expensive. So another writer was brought in just basically to bring the technology level down. But all the
Right,
twists
right.
and turns,
Yeah,
those
they
are
were going to
raw.
be flying helicopters around and everything.
Yeah,
And
yeah, all that stuff.
yeah, yeah,
And interestingly enough, they just recently did a graphic novel of Rod's
mhm,
screenplay of Planet of the Apes to see
yeah,
what his vision of it would have been. And
yeah,
yeah, the Planet of the Apes, 100%. That was the ending was Rod. Yes.
yeah. One of the many interesting episodes is an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. What was unique about that one in particular?
Here's what happened with that. It's a rather interesting story. On the fifth and final season of Twilight Zone, the show was running a little bit over budget, and William Frug, who was the producer then, he saw that film, which was a short film that had been made in France, but it was an adaptation of a story by Ambrose Bierce, the great American writer, and it was set during the Civil War, and all the few lines that were in it were in English, and it has a great twist ending. And so, and it was a half hour long. So he bought the rights to air it twice, and Rod just filmed an opening and closing narration, and bam, they got the show back under budget because it was much less expensive to acquire the rights to air it than it was to actually make another episode. So it was a win-win for everyone. And ironically, because that episode was seen by so many millions of people, it ultimately won an Oscar for Best Short Subject. So one can actually say that Twilight Zone won not only Emmys, but one of the episodes won an Oscar.
Yeah, yeah.
So very fun.
The final Twilight Zone episode in the show's 5-year run was the Bewitching Pool, and it
Yes.
deals with swimming. Um,
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, it was written by Earl Hamner, who was one of the small group of writers who wrote numerous Twilight Zone episodes. Earl Hamner, interesting enough, Rod had won his first credit. Rod Serling's first writing credit was on the Dr. Christian radio show in the late 40s, and it was a show where they had a writing contest, and the winners would get a trip to New York, and they'd watch the performance of their episode of the show. And Rod won that contest, and one of the other winners of that contest was Earl Hamner. And so they met at the beginning of their career. And then years later, Hamner moved to LA and said, "Hey, Rod, I'm around. Is there any work you can throw my way?" And so he started giving him assignments on Twilight Zone. And Hamner was a he later would create the Waltons and Falcon Crest. And he was from Virginia. He was basically John Boy, the character in the Waltons. That's him. That's his family. And so whenever he was writing city folk, they would tend to be cynical jerks, more or less. And when he was writing country folk, they would be like really good people. That was
Yeah.
like his own little prejudice that he thought was rather amusing in retrospect. But the Bewitching Pool is a really interesting episode because it's about a husband and wife who are getting a divorce, and they tell their kids, and their kids, to escape this terrible news, dive into the swimming pool and come up in sort of this children's paradise run by this old lady. And it starred Mary Badham as the little girl, and she was right fresh off To Kill a Mockingbird, playing Scout. And though oddly, when they were shooting some of the episode, I think it was the stuff with the swimming pool. There was a lot of noise, and they couldn't. The dialogue was messed up, and so by the recording, and so they re-recorded the dialogue for her on that part of it by June Foray doing a child's voice. June Foray was the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel,
Oh,
and so her voice changes in different parts of the episode. But one of the fascinating things about that episode was that initially I didn't like that episode, and in Twilight Zone Companion I wrote about that. But then I got a letter from someone that said, when I was a kid, nobody on TV, none of the families on television got divorces. Father Knows Best, My Three Sons, all that stuff. And to see an episode, because his parents divorced, and to see an episode about children reacting to a divorce, it validated his world.
mm,
And I thought, okay, that's totally valid. That's
right.
totally valid. So when I did
Yeah.
the updated edition, I recently did the third edition, and where I added 100 pages of material and 500 new photographs and links to audio and video. So the new edition of the Twilight Zone Companion, I wrote that as an addendum just to say, I was wrong, and or let's say that I had too narrow a vision. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. Now, to me, the kids dive into the swimming pool and they come up in a pond in open water. It's almost like a metaphor for the joy of open water swimming.
I think Hamner was really writing about the artificiality of
Yeah.
sort of that affluent nouveau riche class and the natural world that he had grown up in, as you say, with the swimming hole and the woods and
Yeah.
kind of that very much rural background. So yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Anne Serling, who's has written a moving biography of her dad,
Yeah.
she saw our Blinny theme video on our website, and she told me in an email that she thought Rod would have gotten a kick out of it. And I was
Yes.
kind of relieved to hear that because I was afraid that she would be offended, But
Not a
have you
problem.
seen it?
I haven't seen it, so I definitely
Yeah,
will
yeah,
check it out.
you got to check it out.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun with it. One of my buddies plays Rod, kind of. So,
That's fun. Well,
you
again,
know,
the one thing that people don't know is that Rod had a wonderful sense of humor.
oh
He was
yeah,
a very warm man. I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him. In Hollywood that's filled with so many horrible people.
yeah,
Particularly people who can put on a pleasant facade for the public, but behind the scenes they're awful. Rod was the opposite. I mean, he was absolutely such a kind guy and such
yeah,
a good guy and very funny. And I think Anne is right. He would have loved what you're doing.
yeah. Um, And speaking of that theme video, if when you watch it, you'll notice that I don't use the Twilight Zone theme music, and I would have loved to, but
Uh-huh.
I sent a letter to CBS, or was an email to CBS
Right.
asking for permission and telling them it's nonprofit event, and they
Yeah.
wrote back to me, absolutely not, you cannot use that music. So,
Yeah.
but we had a local high school music student compose something for us that has sort of the same feel to it. And I think it works out pretty well. Yeah.
Right.
Now, in your Twilight Zone Companion, you interviewed Jody Serling,
Yes.
and amongst others, and she tells a really funny tale about an encounter in a supermarket. Um, do you want to talk about that, or should we save it as a tease for future readers?
We can save it as a tease, I think.
Yeah, I thought so, but
But,
it is a
but
great
it's
story,
but it's very interesting because
and it goes
yeah.
well with the George Takei interview that's also there.
Yes. Well,
Yeah,
these are amazing people, and I love their memories. I mean, a big one of the great joys of doing the Twilight Zone Companion was just sitting down with people like the Serling family or Burgess Meredith, or interviewing these amazing people with their memories of Rod and their memories of the Twilight Zone. And it was just such an honor and such a pleasure.
Yeah. Am I correct that on the Blu-ray version of the Twilight Zone, you provide audio commentary?
Yes, I did
Yeah.
52 commentaries. I did 52 commentaries with a ton of people who worked on the show, George Clayton Johnson, Richard Matheson, Richard Donner, and also I did some commentaries with writers who were inspired by Rod Serling, like the creator of Mad Men or Neil Gaiman. So that was also fun to get the younger generation in talking about how they were inspired by Rod to create the work that they created.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I produced that set, and it won the Saturn Award and the Rondo Award, and I'm very proud of it. Though there's still 104 episodes I haven't done commentaries on yet, so eventually I will,
Yeah.
because I have all this stuff in my head, and the moment I have the time, I'll do that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Finally, can you update us on some of the other projects you're working on, such as Space Command?
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. Thank you for asking. I have a YouTube channel called Mr. Sci-Fi, and subscribing to that is the best way to find out what I'm up to. I'm essentially I wanted to do something inspiring like Star Trek or Twilight Zone had been, and rather than going to the networks and having them possibly wreck it or cut it off at pilot, I went to my audience, and between Kickstarter and selling investment shares for $7,500 each, they gave me $4 million to open my own studio and shoot this 12-hour science fiction epic.
Yeah.
And so we've just finished shooting hour 6 of the 12-hour season, and it stars a lot of actors from Star Trek, Robert Picardo, Nichelle Nichols, Doug Jones, on and on.
Yeah.
And so we're actively doing that. We've got 3 sound stages filled with spaceship sets and giant robots and aliens and you name it. And that's just the precursor to we're going to be doing a slate of 6 new science fiction series with many of these wonderful actors as part of an ensemble. So that's where we're headed. So life is great. Life is wonderful.
Yeah. Really cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book, The Twilight Zone Companion, and the series. I think it brings this year's theme, the Glenny Zone, to life.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm so glad that you're doing what you guys are doing. I think that Rod would have loved it. I mean, he would have been the first one to be there in person if he were with us still.
Yeah.
And I never tire of talking about Twilight Zone because it's just great and it's lasted. And I'm so glad that Rod did that work.
Yeah. Thank you again.